from the world of politics.
Speaking for the people of San Francisco, serving the great state of California, and defending our Constitution. And with great confidence in our caucus, I will not seek re-election to Democratic leadership in the next Congress.
To the world of business.
We'd love to work with our American friends. Britain remains a fantastic place for American companies to invest. The more investment we can do in each other's economies, the better for everyone.
This is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. We start again today in Washington, where yesterday we had that historic statement we just heard from Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, saying she would not stand for re-election to leadership of the Democratic caucus, which leads to the question, okay, what happens next? And particularly, what will this new Congress undertake to do? One of the issues is what will happen for U.S. support for Ukraine. And to answer some of those questions, we turn now to Emily Wilkins of Bloomberg Government. Emily, thank you so much for joining us from the Capitol. What do we know or think we know about continued support from the United States for Ukraine?
So we know at this point that the White House has asked Congress for more funding, $37.7 billion, significantly more than previous requests that we've seen for the White House. A lot of this, of course, will be going towards defending Ukraine against the Russian invasion, to military support, but there's also humanitarian aid, aid for energy costs, aid for health care that is all wrapped up in that request from the White House. That's something that Congress is going to be taking a very close look at as they get toward the end of the year. They have to finalize government spending, and that package of requests for Ukraine could easily be a part of that larger legislation that they're looking to get through. At this time, good to remind everyone that Democrats are still in control of both power houses of Congress, and therefore it is likely that they are going to try to accommodate some of Biden's requests. You are seeing a bit of pushback among Republicans saying that they want some more accountability measures for Ukraine going forward, but at the same point, you have seen bipartisan support for continuing to fund the U.S.'s efforts to help Ukraine.
Well, just to pick up on that, Emily, we did hear from Kevin McCarthy, who now is nominated at least to be the Speaker of the House when the new Congress takes office, saying that we shouldn't have a blank check, and then he walked it back a little bit. Do we have a sense whether it's a question of spending less money or just being more careful about exactly what we're spending it on?
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, certainly there is some hesitation to just spending tons and tons of money. Republicans have pointed out that there are other priorities that they feel like the government needs to fund. You've seen a group of far-right Republicans really push, saying that more of that money needs to go to the own U.S.'s southern border. That saying, though, if you look at the wider Republican lawmakers here, the wider Republican conference, many of them are still very supportive in continuing that aid to Ukraine. So I think the expectation here is that we will see a continuation of that aid, but it might come with a few more oversight and accountability measures attached to it.
Okay, Emily, thank you so much for joining us. That's Emily Wilkins of Bloomberg Government. And now we turn to someone who has the experience both in the administration and also up on Capitol Hill when it comes to national security issues. He's William Cohen, chairman and CEO of the Cohen Group. Mr. Cohen served as Secretary of Defense under President Bill Clinton, having earlier served in Congress as a representative and as a senator. So, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for being here. You have a particular point of view here because you served in the Congress as a Republican in the Congress. So what do you make of this talk from some congressional Republicans right now that we should be a bit more careful with the purse strings when it comes to Ukraine?
I think we can be more careful with the purse strings, but I think we have to be more careful with our rhetoric. When those in positions of power use words, they have to understand that it has consequences that can be very dangerous to our allies. The notion that we're putting out there, we're going to hold Ukraine more accountable, we're going to have more audits, that sends a signal not only to the Ukrainians, but also to the Russians, that we are expressing less support for Ukraine rather than more. So I think that came from some members of the Republican Party, the pro-Putin side of the Republican Party, and also some signals came from the Defense Department. Chairman Milley made a statement, a public statement, which I thought was really should be reserved for President of the United States, that perhaps President Zelensky should start thinking about how this might be resolved. over time. I think that's a recommendation that goes to President Biden, not to President Zelensky. So I think those kinds of statements are very, I think, counterproductive at this point. We don't want to do anything or say anything that gives President Putin any sign that we are less than fully committed to the freedom of Ukraine and freedom, basically, of democracies.
Mr. Secretary, let me take it from the other side. Is it possible we should actually be doing more to support the Ukrainians, particularly when it comes to military aid? And if so, what would that be?
But we have to give them more defense capability in terms of shooting down missiles. It's a very difficult correlation here. Usually you can take the offense, you can overwhelm any defensive system. And that's what the Russians are doing now. They're firing 100 missiles a day. And that means you've got to hit them down, knock them down 100% of the time, or some are going to get through. So what the Russians are doing, really brutal, barbaric in the sense of trying to freeze Ukrainians into surrender. So no electricity, no heat, no light, no ability to function, basically, and a cold winter coming up. So what they're doing is pretty brutal. And I think it's a war crime. And I think ultimately President Putin is going to be charged with that at some point in the future. And one other point I'd make out, President Putin decided not to go to the G20 meeting. You have to say, well, why is that so? Given all that's going on in the world, why would he not go to G20, where he would be at least welcome, presumably? But he's worried about back home. I think he's afraid to leave Moscow for fear that there would be an attempt to take power from within. Otherwise, I can't imagine why he wouldn't take advantage of going to meet with President Xi, meet with other leaders of the G20. He could fly back and forth, but at least make a stop in Bali and go back home. I think he was worried about what would happen in his absence.
Mr. Secretary, let's talk about that G20, because there was some concern they wouldn't even be able to get a joint communique out of it. They did, and it addressed Ukraine, maybe not quite as strongly as the United States might have hoped, but I think more strongly than a lot of people thought. But you really know how to read these communiques. What did you take away from what the G20 said?
I take away that the G20 believes strongly that President Putin made not only a mistake, but took illegal, inappropriate action that violates every norm that has been in existence since the end of the Second World War. So I was meeting with former leaders from the United States, Canada, England, and other parts of the European continent. And we had a meeting all weekend this past 2.5 days, talking about exactly Ukraine, how we continue to support Ukraine, and also what this means in terms of China. I want to commend President Biden for meeting with President Xi. Really important steps taken to try and de-escalate certainly the rhetoric, but also the potential for miscalculation or error that could lead us into a military conflict. So I think two important things took place: the reaffirmation of support for Ukraine, and also the need for President Biden to meet with Xi to set a course for at least some level of cooperation going forward into the future. I think very important.
And I think, Mr. Secretary, it was generally understood that meeting with President Xi at least put a floor under the deterioration in the relationship between the United States and China, but also said that they would continue to work at the staff level. Already, we've had the U.S. Trade Representative, Tai, actually meet with her counterpart over there on their outskirts of it. But when it comes to military matters, what sort of coordination should we be promoting with the Chinese to make sure we don't make a mistake?
We need to stay in contact with them in terms of having, the red phones to be able to talk directly between our Secretary of Defense and their counterpart to that. The president needs to be in touch with President Xi at critical moments. But communication engagement is critical between two big powers with nuclear weapons. Not allowing either the rhetoric or the potential to spin out of control. So I think the G20, I think we're happy to see that kind of effort being made now. I think China needs us as well as we need to make sure that they don't take measures dealing with Taiwan that uses any kind of military force, which will lead to a conflict in the region. But China, their economy is not doing that well. They need to continue to have Western engagement and investment in order to improve their economic situation. So I think it benefits them. It will benefit us by reducing the possibility of coming into conflict with the Chinese. And basically, all of our allies in the region, all of the ASEAN countries, all of our Asian countries, and those in the Asia Pacific and the Indo-Pacific, they want to make sure that we don't somehow step into a conflict with the Chinese, either by miscalculation or mistake. And I think Joe Biden deserves credit now with President Xi saying, okay, we have differences. We can cooperate, we can compete, and we can confront each other. We have those choices to make. So let's make the one for cooperation, collaboration when possible, and confrontation if necessary, but avoid the confrontation if at all possible.
Mr. Secretary, you mentioned Taiwan, which has been the source of some increasing tension between China and the United States through the summer. And part of it was, frankly, because I think Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. At this point, it looks like President Xi and President Biden, at least in part, tried to take away some of that tension. From your point of view, strategically, what can the United States do to make sure that that does not get out of control?
I think we, number one, continue to provide defensive capability to the Taiwanese. At the same time, not by word or deed, send the signal that we are encouraging them to be able to confront or engage in conflict with China itself. So I think when we say we're going to provide weapons that might be seen as offensive in an offensive capability to the Chinese, that's crossing a red line as far as the Chinese are concerned. If the Chinese say that we're prepared and are planning to take military action, that's a red line for us. So what we ought to do is understand where the red lines are, making sure we don't come so close to those lines that somehow either one side or the other makes a mistake and suddenly there is a conflict. That is the worst situation we can see, because then you have not only Taiwan involved, but then you have all of our Asian countries who are allies of ours potentially getting involved. And our Asian friends do not want to see a conflict in any way between the United States and China over Taiwan, because they're in the neighborhood. There will be consequences for them. And they say, okay, we want to make sure China doesn't take aggressive action under these circumstances. But at the same time, they don't want to see the United States poke a finger in the eye of the Chinese, in the eye of the dragon, so to speak, and push it to a conflict type of situation, or confrontation at the very least. So I think both sides have an interest in reducing the rhetoric and reducing exercises that appear to be designed to provoke each other. So President Xi can take those actions. He can say that we're going to try to find a way to work with the United States. He can do something about sending signals to the North Koreans. We haven't talked about them, but they are engaging in very dangerous behavior by firing missiles that fly over Japan. And if anything should go wrong there, then we have another situation where it could spill into warfare. So the Chinese can exercise some influence over the North Koreans. The Chinese certainly can lower the rhetoric in terms of Taiwan. And we can respect the fact that we have a one China policy. And that one China policy also includes the Taiwan Relations Act, which says that we'll provide defensive capability to the Taiwanese. So what we're encouraging the Chinese to do, if there's going to be a reunion, it should be done through peaceful means, economic, diplomatic, but peaceful means, and not through war, and not through the exercise of military power.
Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate this. William Cohen, he's chairman and CEO of the Cohen Group. Coming up, we're going to talk with Democratic Congresswoman Robin Kelly about what comes next for the Democratic Congressional Caucus without Speaker Pelosi at the helm. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Just about 24 hours ago right now, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi took to the floor to announce that she would not stand for re-election to leadership. But in doing so, she really commended the future leadership without specifying who it would be. This is part of what she said.
For me, the hours come for a new generation to lead the Democratic caucus that I so deeply respect. And I'm grateful that so many are ready and willing to shoulder this awesome responsibility.
We turn now to one of those who will be shouldering the responsibility as part of the Democratic caucus is Robin Kelly. She's Democratic Congresswoman from Illinois. So, Congresswoman, thank you for being here. I guess the most important question at the moment is, what are you looking for in that next generation that Nancy Pelosi is talking about?
I think someone tenacious, inclusive, approachable, who has our democratic values. But I think, we have that person already.
And would that by any chance be Hakeem Jeffries? Just to guess.
Yes, it would be.
Okay, tell us what
I think
what he contributes, what he will give you that you need.
Well, he's already doing it as the chair of the Democratic Party. Hakeem is very supportive of members. He's inclusive. He's flown all over the place to help members, at a moment's notice. He's already sacrificed, so much of his time. He's smart. He's caring. He's compassionate. I just think he's the right person for this time.
I've seen the letter that you sent around. He also has raised a fair amount of money for candidates, as I see it.
He's raised a fair amount of money for candidates. He helped me when I was the chair of the Democratic Party of Illinois. He's helped so many people, and he always takes the time. As I said, he's very approachable. He pays close attention to detail. He's the one for me.
So nobody does it all by themselves. As powerful as Nancy Pelosi was, she did have Steny Hoyer, she did have Jim Clyburn. What about the other two members at the very top there? I know that we're talking about Catherine Clark as well as Pete Aguilar.
Well, they will have my support also. I always tease Catherine because I came in special election and she was after me. So she gave me my Democratic seniority. Both, again, approachable, caring, well respected by colleagues, which I think is really, really important, especially when there's a significant change.
So if that, in fact, is the leadership of the Democratic caucus going forward, in minority now, not majority, it strikes me there's one big difference. They're younger. But there are also, I think, a couple of other differences. They are somewhat more diverse. You will have, I believe, the first black person to be the head of one of the major caucuses in the Congress. And also, they are, if I may say so, somewhat more moderate.
I think it depends on what the topic is. We're not, as you know, Democrats definitely are not monolithic, but I think that on main issues, there's a lot of agreement. But also, it's okay that there's not agreement. That's what makes democracy also, that we can agree to disagree, but still move on and look at the bigger picture. And I think those three can do that and lead us in that way.
And what about the diversity issue? Because that's something also that Nancy Pelosi addressed yesterday, that she took great pride in the fact that the caucus is more diverse, although I believe she said you still have a ways to go.
Oh, definitely. We're all very, very proud of that we look like America. And yes, there can be more women elected, more people of color, more LGBTQ, more people from other religions and those kind of things. There can always be more. But I think that, we are more and more representative of what this country looks like.
One of the pieces of history yesterday was Nancy Pelosi saying she is not leaving the Congress. She's going to continue representing her district out in San Francisco. I believe that's the first time since 1955 that that's been true, where a speaker has continued in the House. Do you have a sense of what her role will be? I think she said she doesn't want to be the mother-in-law in the kitchen saying, my son doesn't like the stuffing made that way.
Yeah. Well, she's like emeritus and someone that Hakeem or Catherine or Pete can go to, for advice. I mean, she's a very smart, shrewd leader. So, she'll be someone that all of us can go to, quite frankly. And I'm sure she's not going to stop raising money. She was fantastic, tremendous, raising money for the caucus. I'm sure she still wants to be helpful because she wants us to be successful.
One more, if I could. We talked about who will be leading. In what direction will they be leading? And this is a specific question. Now you're in the minority. There are a couple of different alternatives. One is to be the party of no, just blocking anything from the Republicans. Another would be to find some things to do in a bipartisan way. Are there things you can do?
I think that knowing who the leadership is, we are trying to move this country forward. So we just don't want to say no, like has happened to us, just to say no. We still want to move the country forward. And that will lead us to 2024.
Okay, Congressman, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. That's Robin Kelly,
quite welcome.
Democratic Congressman from Illinois. Still to come, Ian Bremmer of the Eurasia Group on the aftermath of the G20 and the continuing war in Ukraine. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time to check in on the markets and what they're doing, and more important, why they're doing it. For that, we turn to Kriti Gupta. So, Kriti, it doesn't look to me like there's a lot of movement in equities, but you think maybe there's more than it looks.
There is, because we started off the open up over 1%, and you saw that in futures, this really big acceleration. It almost felt like people were buying into a weekend, which is rare, David. You know, Fridays are always kind of this risk-off day. You cash out before you start off your 2 days off. But I think what's going on is a lot in the cross-asset space. Take a look at what's happening in oil, for example. Brent crude trading with an 87 handle, NYMEX crude with a 79 handle. And really, it kind of feels like they're starting to price in this concept of recession. A big part of the narrative has been, when do we see this tipping point between inflation being the driver versus growth concerns being the driver? And so far, if you were a believer that inflation is still driving the story, the commodity complex as a whole is going to be higher. If you think that growth is going to be more of the concern, i.e. recession in 2023, which, by the way, the odds are starting to price in more and more, that's when you start to see that sell-off in the commodity space. So it's not just Brent crude. And that kind of sentiment is going to feed into the equity markets as well, which is probably why you're seeing this, down about 0.3% on the day, but the intraday move is over 1%.
And I'm going to get way out of my skis here, but as I understand it, they've gone into contango, which is an important development, the relationship of the current price as opposed to the future price.
It is. Now, it's a little bit of a wonky concept, so stick with me here. Essentially, this idea that you want your oil contracts that go month by month, you want your most nearest contract to be the highest price, because that signals that it's the most highest price because there's the most demand for it in the here and the now. But if you start to see that flip where you have the nearest contract be a lower price than the further out contracts, that tells you that the demand in the here and now isn't as healthy as it is further out. In other words, you're going to see a slowdown closer to now than you are in the future. And it's that concept that creates essentially this idea of contango, which signals an oversupply in the near term, AKA recession.
And you know what I'm going to ask, which is, and what does that mean for the Fed? Because you always bring it back to the Fed sooner or later.
Well, I think everyone does in this particular market. What it means for the Fed, I think, and for the bond market is that, do you start to see this deceleration across even the food prices or even the housing market? Because it's not just an oil story anymore the way it was, say, 6 months ago.
Kriti, thank you so much. That was really terrific. That's Kriti Gupta. And you can catch her again anchoring at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Markets. Coming up, we're going to talk with Ian Bremmer of the Eurasia Group. What came out of the G20 and what will come out of COP27, which is winding down this weekend. It's not clear they're going to get everything accomplished that they set out to do. That all is coming up next. And this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We want to keep you up to date with news from all around the world. From there, we turn to Mark Crumpton here with the first word.
David, thank you. New York Representative Hakeem Jeffries has formally put himself in the running to become the House Democratic leader as the party undergoes a historic generational shift. Jeffries would be the first black party leader in Congress and would succeed House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who's leaving leadership but is staying in Congress. Minneapolis Fed President Neil Kashkari said that the whole idea of cryptocurrency is, quote, nonsense after the implosion of FTX Group. Kashkari posted a tweet saying, quote, this isn't the case of one fraudulent company in a serious industry. The entire notion of crypto is nonsense. He continued, not useful for payments, no inflation hedge, no scarcity, no taxing authority, just a tool of speculation and greater fools, end quote. Qatari officials are set to ban the sale of alcohol within its World Cup stadiums. The move is a dramatic reversal of an earlier decision to allow Anheuser-Busch to sell Budweiser beer. Bloomberg has learned it will likely result in moving concession stands serving alcohol further away from the stadiums. Fans who've shelled out thousands of dollars for private hospitality suites will be unaffected by the ban. The tournament kicks off Sunday with the hosts taking on Ecuador. Brazil's central bank chief Roberto Campos Neto said that he will persist in efforts to combat inflation as the incoming government advances plans to add billions of dollars to public spending next year. Policymakers will continue to take steps to meet its consumer price mandate, the chief said at a Bloomberg event in Sao Paulo. The effort comes after Neto led one of the world's first and most aggressive interest rate hiking cycles in the wake of the pandemic. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, we have a new Congress coming in the new year, and it's going to be narrowly divided, with Republicans having a very small majority on the House side and the Senate remaining in Democratic hands, although, again, very narrowly. One question is what this might mean, if anything, for U.S. foreign policy. And for an answer to that question, we turn now to Ian Bremmer. He's founder and president of the Eurasia Group and G0 Media. Ian, great to have you with us. Before we get to the G20, what do you think will be the effect, if any, on U.S. foreign policy of what happened in the midterms?
Not meaningful on Russia. A level of support from Republicans and Democrats is going to be continually very strong. It's only a few on the fringes of both parties that are really raising big questions there. China will get a little harder line. We'll see more Republicans from the House that will be driving trips to Taiwan and talking about the desire to have more American corporations leave China or reduce their Chinese footprint, bring it back to the United States, bring it to friendly countries. There'll be a little bit of that. That's probably the most significant move. But the other thing I would mention is not about U.S. foreign policy, but how the United States is perceived internationally. And the fact that all of the election deniers that were running for governorships as well as for Secretary of State positions in key swing states, they all lost, means that the potential, the tail risk of a constitutional crisis of breaking the 2024 election, which allies around the world were increasingly worried about, has really gone away. And in that regard, it was a good day for U.S. democracy and a good day for the way the United States is perceived internationally. It
was also a good day, I think most would agree, for President Biden. Although he did lose the House by a narrow majority, he did much better than anyone expected, and much better, by the way, than historical norms would suggest as he went into the G20. Looking at the G20, how did he fare over there?
He fared pretty well. Of course, he had a spring in his step because they did exceed expectations in the midterms, and it could have gone a lot worse for him, though clearly a Republican-led House is going to be deeply problematic in terms of the investigations against Biden and the rest, and that'll be a show. But in the G20 itself, the meeting with Xi Jinping did, I think, help to stabilize the relationship between the United States and China that, frankly, has been deteriorating pretty dramatically over the course of the past years. And let's be clear, the leaders of the United States and China have not met face-to-face for 2 years now, and the pandemic's a big part of that. But Xi and Biden know each other quite well and actually get along reasonably well, so that absence made a difference. And 3 hours face-to-face, I think will lead to much more significant high-level engagement on areas that there can be some level of cooperation, like, for example, dealing with extended indebtedness for some of the poorest countries in the world, some basic trade issues, some climate issues. So that's a positive that comes out of the G20 for Biden. A second positive is the fact that increasingly most of the G20 countries are getting angry at the expansion of the Russian invasion into Ukraine. And that is, of course, what allowed you to get a joint communique that the Russians clearly weren't happy about, but they had no choice about.
Well, let me pick up on that specifically, Ian, because you and I have talked before on this program about the fact that we have the United States and NATO, some other Western allies, but then there's the rest of the world that really has not so much supported the United States. But here you had a joint communique that came out that was reasonably starchy, if I can put it that way, with respect to Russia. And the reporting behind the scenes was that countries such as India and Indonesia really helped. Are we seeing a shift there in the dynamics?
Yeah, these are, of course, the developing world still sees a lot of Western hypocrisy in support for Ukraine and not support for a whole bunch of other issues that they see as major human rights challenges, whether it's the Palestinians or it's Yemen or it's Sudan or you name it. So that isn't going away. And of course, these poorer countries are also not going to support U.S. sanctions on Russia. They're still trying to buy commodities that come out of Russia as cheaply as they possibly can, including a strategic partner like India. It's actually buying more oil from Russia right now, even than the Chinese are. So I don't want to go too far on this, but I do want to say that the Russians are recognized by pretty much everyone around the world as having gotten this war very, very badly. And whether you're talking to the Americans or the Indians or even the Chinese, everyone wants the war to stop. Everyone wants an end of hostilities. How you get there, there's a lot of disagreement. How public you'll be on pressing the Russians, there's a lot of disagreement. But no one likes this war.
Ian, you mentioned the meeting, of course, between President Xi and President Biden, and also the possibility of further talks. We already have, reportedly, Catherine Tai, the USTR, meeting with her counterpart from China around the edges of the G20. Reportedly, Secretary of State Tony Blinken will be going over to visit Beijing. Take us through those talks. What do you expect from those? What are the important ones that should happen?
Well, first of all, assuming that Janet Yellen's not going to be Treasury anymore, I think whoever her replacement will be is going to be very critical in an ongoing relationship with China. And I say that because that is where you get the greatest recognition of the importance of U.S.-Chinese interdependence, economic interdependence, financial interdependence, trade interdependence. And Yellen, who I like a lot personally, I respect her a lot. She's a wonderful person, but she's not at all political. She doesn't have sharp elbows, and she hasn't had a lot of access to the White House. That needs to change. And when it does, I think that relationship and that engagement with economic leaders in China is going to be absolutely critical. Beyond that, I would say, it's going to be the national security issues, particularly on technology, because as much as everyone was happy to see Biden and Xi Jinping meet for 3 hours and not throw each other out of the room, the fact is that U.S. policy on technology is a policy of Chinese containment. And here I'm specifically talking about semiconductors and the export controls around that. That's going to be a challenging policy to implement, to get allies on board. And it's also going to lead to a lot of tension with the Chinese, including, of course, over TSMC, the Taiwanese semiconductor company, which has become the most important company strategically in the entire world.
Ian, I wonder whether perhaps we, the markets indeed, are underestimating the extent to which those export controls that were imposed with respect to things like semiconductors and manufacturing, are we underestimating how threatening that is to the Chinese? And by the way, I understand there's talk about even going further with export controls on things like biotech.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in areas that are considered to be dual use for national security and for the Chinese military, you're going to see policies of containment by the United States. And when that policy was first announced on semiconductors back on October 7th, it did not get a lot of attention. People still talk about the idea of a military invasion of Taiwan, the conventional buildup, the military exercises, the missile tests. That's not where the future of this conflict is going. It's much more about the fact that for the last 30 years, the United States has basically given up on the production of semiconductors. And Taiwan, which is only 100 miles away from the mainland, is absolutely indispensable to American national security and economic development. That's a much greater vulnerability for the United States than any decisions that Angela Merkel made over energy dependence on the Russians, for example, but it hasn't gotten a lot of attention in the United States.
So connect those two things, if you could, because I was going to ask about Taiwan. Have we put back that sort of ring fence around Taiwan, as it were, that Henry Kissinger first did with Zhou Enlai, because it seemed to be eroding, or is that going to continue being an issue, and as you just suggested, it'll be exacerbated by the semiconductor situation?
It is absolutely a top issue described by Xi Jinping at the G20 as a red line for China. That's language that they haven't explicitly used before, that he hasn't explicitly used before. But that doesn't mean there's going to be an invasion tomorrow. I've never thought that the more militaristic headlines around Taiwan that you see when Biden says, oh, the U.S. is going to defend Taiwan, might we be heading for war? In the near term, the answer is no. But in the medium to long term, the Americans are going to work as hard and as fast as possible through the CHIPS Act and through a number of other policies to try to ensure that the U.S. is no longer so vulnerable to Taiwan and TSMC. The Chinese are going to do the same thing. And that's not likely to happen as successfully or as quickly for both the United States and China. In other words, you are going to change the status quo in the relationship over Taiwan as we start to compete directly in containment over semiconductors. I think that makes the policy of U.S.-China relations in Taiwan sharper and harder to resolve in the medium to long term. And here we're talking about 5 to 10 years.
Ian, so great to have you with us. As always, it was really informative. That's Ian Bremmer of the Eurasia Group. Coming up, we're going to talk New York real estate with Bill Rudin of Rudin Management. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. One of the areas that has been hard hit by the pandemic has been real estate, and certainly those of us in New York City know about that. It is coming back. The question is how fast is it coming back? How completely has it come back? And for answers to those questions, we welcome now Bill Rudin. He's co-chair and CEO of Rudin Management, which owns, builds, and manages commercial and residential properties throughout New York City. So welcome, Bill. Great to have you here.
Well, Dave, it's great to be here in person with you.
Yeah, it's a treat, right? We're back. Yeah. We're back. So how far back has it come, real estate? And you can start with residential.
Well, I think it's directly correlated to when the vaccines started coming out. So in the beginning of 21, we started to see the market come back. It had taken a big hit in 20, and every month we started to see occupancy go up, the concessions come down, and that's continued through now. We still see tremendous leasing activity. We're going to sign like a half a dozen leases this week, and there's tremendous demand. And particularly as you've seen the interest rates go up and people, put the brakes on buying apartments.
Well, I was going to ask that. Are people shifting over to renting from buying, given what's going on with mortgage rates?
Well, it was happening before interest rates in terms of occupancy and people coming back to the city. You remember after, right after the pandemic, people were leaving. They're back, and you can walk around the streets. You feel the energy. Retail is back. People are out in the restaurants. It's definitely a positive vibe going on.
So
now.
You talked about occupancy rates. Where are you on occupancy rates in rental compared to 2018, 2019, before the pandemic? How does it compare?
We're either equal to or above where we were. We're above 95%, 96% occupancy. And when we get an apartment, we fix it up, turn it over, and we rent it relatively quickly. It's much quicker turnaround in terms of making deals than it was a couple of years ago.
What about commercial? Because I have a sense that at least in some places it's tougher because although we're back to work, a lot of people have not come back to the office.
Well, an interesting fun fact, we're 38% in terms of deal activity compared to a year ago. We're about 20 million square feet of leases signed, not in our portfolio, but throughout the city in Manhattan. So we've had a good 3 quarters heading into the fourth quarter. It's slowed down a little bit. Commercial, I think tenants are looking at opportunities. We've seen some significant deals done in the last 6 months. Companies like Lowe's, O'Melveny & Myers, M&T Bank, Fidelity. So the market for Class A space is where the action is.
That was going to be my question. Class A, because I hear that about Class A. I hear it's a lot rougher for Class B, Class C, particularly in Midtown.
Well, all over the city. Class B is very stressed at the moment, and there is a solution to it, David. In Lower Manhattan in the mid-'90s, when downtown had 30 million feet of vacant space, 30% of the market, the city and the state and the private sector came together and created the downtown plan, which allowed conversions of obsolete office buildings to residential. So you went from 10,000 people living in Lower Manhattan to 70,000 people living in Lower Manhattan. That's what we need to do in Midtown.
Is that a matter of regulation, zoning,
yes,
and things, or is it a matter of capital to make the conversion?
It's all the above. We need the public sector to allow the zoning changes. allow tax incentives, affordability components, and then you'll see the private sector step in. People want to walk to work. Our buildings that are close in Midtown, not far from here, those are usually the first to have vacancy, increase and the slowest to come back. This time around, they were the quickest to come back because people want to be able to get close access to their offices. And if the city and the state, and I know the mayor and the governor really want to do this, and it's part of the increasing need for more housing at all sectors, this will be an important step to allow people to convert these buildings.
Bill, I have to ask you about crime, because whether it's really a problem or a perceived problem, it's an issue. And I hear, not only in New York, but also in major cities, people saying, I don't feel safe on the streets. Is that affecting, do you think, your residential business?
Oh, well, crime is definitely an issue, and it's just not in New York. You're seeing it all over the country. And I think people, want to be in the city. You see the people out on the streets. The more it's all a virtuous positive cycle, more people coming into the city. Subway ridership is up, but it's something that needs to be addressed and focused on at all levels of government.
One last question. How much are rates affecting you? You build and you rebuild and things like that. You've got a lot of investment, for example, right now, I think number 3 Times Square. Is that affecting your business because it's a lot more expensive?
It's definitely affecting a lot of segments of the market. We just seen, though, some financing done at 660 Fifth Avenue, did a $1.4 billion financing. There was a financing done in Brooklyn for a residential project, but it's definitely having an impact. Luckily for us, we were able to sort of lock our rates in going forward. But the market is definitely, there's a lot of there's a lot of turbulence in the world. And in the economy, but I think long term we will get through this and the city will come out the other side in a very positive way.
Really great review of New York real estate. Really appreciate it, Bill. Great to have you here in the studio. That's Bill Rudin. He's co-chairman and CEO of Rudin Management Company. Coming up, what the antitrust laws have to say about your difficulty in getting Taylor Swift tickets. Yeah, that's what I meant. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. There is a crisis going on in America, and it has to do with Taylor Swift and getting tickets to her latest tour. To take us through exactly what's happening, we welcome now Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow. So, Ed, tell me about what the problem is in getting tickets to Taylor Swift concerts.
Yeah, so look, earlier this week there was a pre-sale for select fans to buy tickets. Ticketmaster's site crashed. They had 3.5 billion system requests, which is 4 times their previous peak. Basically half of the world's population worth of data, and lots of people were left disappointed. This is Taylor Swift's upcoming tour. They were going to put tickets on general release this Friday, and it got scrapped. And you have Swifties, which is the name for Taylor Swift fans, very disappointed. And this story has got very quickly political.
Well, I actually see now, just as you were speaking, I saw a headline cross here that she says it's excruciating to watch the mistakes and that she says she's going to provide more opportunities for fans. But what has the government got to do with it? I mean, I don't normally think of the government guaranteeing I can get Taylor Swift tickets.
It's about control of the market. Some groups say that Ticketmaster controls 70% of the market for live tickets. The company dispute that. They say it's more like 30%, according to comments by the CEO. You have key lawmakers like Senator Klobuchar, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez saying this is not right. We need to break up live event, the parent company of Ticketmaster. And they're basically jumping on the momentum of social media. Swifties, as they're known, as you now know, David, have just been pouring onto social media platforms to talk about this because the system was broken in their eyes. 2 million tickets were sold, but there are millions of people who wanted to be part of this tour that were left disappointed.
Hey, Ed, this is a great report. I'm a little hurt you didn't think I knew that Taylor Swift fans were called Swifties.
I apologize.
No, in fairness, I think I just did learn it. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow reporting on what's going on with Ticketmaster and Taylor Swift. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and also online. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk to historian Barbara Perry of UVA about that wedding at the White House tomorrow. This is Balance of Power, and we are on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio.